Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Eric Sidoti. I'm the director of the Whitlam Institute, and we have the great pleasure of living in this wonderful old building. Before starting, as is our custom, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. And in this part of Sydney, it's the Darug people whose lands stretch between the rivers, the Nepean, the Hawkesbury, the Georges, and of course the Parramatta River. I'm pleased to say that the elders, the Darug elders, are very involved with campus life, and the stories, of course, that nurtured the land are part of the stories that built into the history of this very place. So it's to their elders, past and present, that I, on behalf of us all, pay our respects. Welcome on behalf of the Whitlam Institute and the Centre for Media History at Macquarie University, whose director, Professor Bridget Griffin-Foley, is with us this morning. And I understand several people associated with the centre as well. Welcome to all of you. It's a really exciting way to start the year with this 40th anniversary birthday. In doing so, of course, before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the support of the new Triple J itself and Chris Scadden and others there. And we're absolutely delighted today that the ABC, Radio National Big Ideas, are here to record the event for future posterity, and we'll replay it on the 50th, I guess, eh? We're also filming for podcasting through the Institute and the Centre. So just so as you know all of that, so it will be captured. The format is fairly straightforward for this morning. Pretty soon we'll have the reason we're all here, and Liz will talk to us, after which there'll be time for some questions and answers. And at the conclusion, of course, there'll be some refreshments, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the permanent exhibition of Gough Whitlam. My mind's been wandering over the events this time 40 years ago. The reformist zeal of the Whitlam government remained undiminished in spite of the myriad obstacles thrown in its path. The bold gamble of the double dissolution election in May 1974 had paid off to the extent that the unprecedented joint sitting of the Parliament in August of that year had delivered two of the greatest Whitlam reforms, the universal healthcare packages and the electoral reform bills, which entrenched one vote, one value for the first time. It's clear, though, that even at this stage 40 years ago, the dark clouds were massing overhead and the threats to the government's political survival were unabated. It was a new year, and who knew what might lie ahead? As it turns out, no one really did. Gough would not have known that at that very time the Governor-General was secretly convening a group of legal experts at ANU and conversing with a High Court judge to advise him on the extent of the so-called reserve powers. The coup had commenced. He most certainly would have had little idea of the cultural cyclone that was about to be unleashed with the creation of a youth station within the mildly stuffy ABC in an abandoned basement in King's Cross. Not far, in fact, from the offices that Gough himself inhabited at 100 William Street from the time he lost the leadership through to his death on the 21st of October last year. History, as we all know, is a fickle creature. We are fortunate today to have Dr. Liz Giuffre with us to share something of this history, this particular history, with us. Liz is a lecturer in media, music and cultural studies and an associate member of the Centre of Media History at Macquarie University. She holds a PhD in Media, Music and Cultural Studies and an MA Research in Contemporary Music, both from Macquarie, and a BA from the University of New South Wales. I'm sure she's contemplating further work here at UWS, one would hope. Her research and teaching experience includes engagement with music and media crossings, screen sound, particularly music and television, artist and audience engagement, and Australian cultural histories of popular music and post-broadcast media. In addition to all this, she works regularly in the National Independent Arts Press as a journalist and commentator, including work as the regular contributing editor for Metro magazine, a regular contributor to critical studies in television, and an occasional contributor for The Conversation, which makes me think where she found the time to prepare for today. It is my great pleasure to invite Dr. Liz Giuffre to tickle history's tummy on this Triple J's 40th birthday, which she quite rightly calls a big day for the young men and women of Australia.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, everyone, for coming. So, 2JJ, the Sydney station that would become National Youth Network Triple J, began broadcasting out of a makeshift studio in King's Cross in inner Sydney on 11 a.m. at January 19, 1975, 40 years ago today, roughly now. The station was conceived by the then Whitlam Government, who had lent the kids a blanket to make a cubby house under the kitchen table of the ABC. 2JJ, or Double J as it came to be known, came about as the result of a report published in 1974 which outlined the Australian government's policy of encouraging plurality of involvement in the media, and in particular to develop the ABC's request for creative programming. Double J began with a sound that has now been entrenched in Australian media history, a piece of rebellious local popular music. Let's play with this for a minute. Whoop. Needles are hard. Yep. Here we go. Genuine AM 1975 sound. Have to fade it down. Okay. So in lots of ways, that song, Skyhooks You Just Like Me 'Cause I'm Good in Bed, really does embody all that we like to remember about the station. It's youthful, it's shiny, it's rocky, it's energetic, and it's less than slightly naughty. The song is a soundbite of early Double J that gets most often circulated. And don't get me wrong, it's great. It was a breakthrough sound for the local scene. It was a song commercial radio wouldn't play because of its blatant lyrics, and it was also a bridge between the Melbourne and Sydney scenes. This was a song and a sound that was perfect for a station experimenting with ways to represent contemporary young men and women of Australia. It was edgy and also deceptively simple. There's only 4 chords that hold it together, a simple chorus and a top-heavy riff. But it's a song that also asks questions about representations of the young. Are they just bodies to be co-opted and objectified? And how and who might be part of this objectification? There is more to this song than Shirl singing Greg's lyrics over Red's riff. This is a sound and a song of young Australians wanting the opportunity to express themselves in more than one way. Now today I want to build on that early sound, revisiting another early piece of Double J broadcasting history. Rather than another song, this time here at the Whitlam Institute and with the Centre for Media History, I want to explore an interaction between the station and Gough Whitlam himself. The piece I'll be revisiting is an interview Whitlam did with Double J just after the dismissal and just before the election in early December 1975. At this time, both the station and the politician were in a precarious position, unsure of what, if any, support they might continue to have from the Australian public in the months and years to come. I'm going to use this interview as the focus today to share with you a little more of the context of Double J as it was born and then grew. By extension, I think this also helps us understand how young Australians have come to be drawn into the media today as we know it, as active participants and active audience members. I first found the details of this interview as part of the Whitlam Institute's e-collections. The written transcript had been donated by Whitlam in 2003. Although now nearly 40 years old, a lot of the issues discussed during the exchange remain familiar. Media ownership and its concentration, political responsibilities and broken promises, speculation about possible cuts to the ABC, and the responsibilities of public figures to the diversity of Australians that they're meant to be representing. However, not everything was familiar. The interview seemed to have gone for a long time, well over half an hour, and appeared to be conducted by several Double J staffers. Now, these things really struck me. What a large amount of time for the leader to dedicate to a small youth radio station in Sydney. And what an unusual approach for the resource-strapped broadcaster to make, literally coming at Mr. Whitlam from different angles. And I should add, the journey to find the recording of this interview has in itself been something of a feat. The ABC didn't think it existed, although with thanks to my colleague and super sleuth, Dr. Janine Baker, as well as Brian and all from the National Archives, we have tracked it down. I want to also acknowledge and thank some of the original Double J employees who helped me on the journey of trying to put back together this puzzle. In particular, Marius Webb, Nick Franklin, Dennis Altman and Ros Chaney, who continued to support the station and its now 40-year legacy with energy and remarkable memories. I dread to think what memories, if any, I'll have in a few decades' time. So the purpose of today is to mark a birthday, celebrating the establishment of a dedicated place for young Australians in the media. It was a place where they were not just talked about, nor were they talked down to, but a place where young people could actually lead the conversation. Now, as we go through, perhaps you can imagine that I'm a daughter wishing her parents a happy birthday on the occasion of their big 4-0. Imagining myself as a daughter to Double and later Triple J hasn't been too hard, because in many ways I feel that I am a product of this institution. As a 34-year-old Australian media scholar and practitioner, it has never quite occurred to me that young people would not have a place in our media, or the right to ask questions of those in power. As well, a place to represent ourselves with our own music, comedy, talk, and other forms of artistry. I literally know no different. But at the time of this interview and of the launch of Double J in January 1975, these really were new ideas. Many media scholars, commentators and audiences have praised the persistence and evolution of radio, a medium that should have been killed by subsequent new technologies like TV, online and social media, but continues to be popular and influential. Its immediacy and intimacy is what allows this to happen, as well as flexibility of access. Radio can be taken with us in cars, on public transport, or hidden under a pillow to be listened to late into the night. It's also cheap to access and maintain, something that makes it particularly accessible for young people. I don't know about you, but getting my first radio that was just mine to listen to what I wanted to listen to was a key part of me gaining my independence. It seems that all involved in Double J in 1975 were aware of radio's power as a form of communication. Whitlam talked about the significance of radio as part of this interview. It seems apt to have this comment about the medium from the interview as the first piece that I'll play you. So please enjoy and excuse its 1975 recorded and reproduced glory. Here we go.
But at least the public is coming to rely on radio more than on TV, and on TV more than newspapers, for their news and views. And I think the control by this trinity of all the newspapers in Australia has diminished the standing of the newspapers as organs of news, information, discussion in Australia. The three proprietors have been so heavy-handed, so monolithic, that they are destroying their organ.
Mr. Whitlam, if I could say...
This clip comes about 11 minutes into the interview, and up until this point, questions about the state of Australia as a democracy and relative media bias have been asked. Whitlam's reference to the newspapers was expanded later on, where he talked about the trinity of ownership again, what he called one person, Murdoch, one family, the Fairfaxes, and one company, the Herald and Weekly Times. Now, it's clear from these comments that Whitlam was eager for Australians to experience a media that had a diverse ownership base, as well as a diversity of media forms to choose from. As I mentioned at the beginning, this was the logic that set up Double J in the first place. It therefore makes sense then that the station would use a panel of announcers to talk to Whitlam, diversity in action, all in one interview. However, retracing the details of this panel 40 years on has been something of a challenge. The archives don't include any details about the context of the broadcast. Was it part of a news feature, a regular segment, an election special? The latter is particularly important because it would be easy to look back with rose-coloured glasses and assume that just because Whitlam's government helped establish the station, the outlet would simply become a Gough Party branch. Indeed, some commentators over the years have suggested this, the basic logic being if you give the young people the vote, then they'll vote for you. But to assume this without digging a bit further does no service to the politician or to the station itself. While many of the 1975 internal communications have been lost over time, as you'd expect, what I have been able to find in order to unearth some of the context is a letter to the editor from Double J staffer Lee Duffield. On December 16, 1975, Lee wrote to the Sydney Morning Herald defending allegations of left bias by the station. He wrote in the letters pages, "Sir, letters on 11 December charges that 2JJ has been promoting the Labor Party during the election campaign and denying access to others. The following is in fact what we have done. 1. A series of 8 one-hour debates have been held on air between leading spokesmen for the Labor and Liberal Party. 2. The station provided a free rally service open to all political parties. The idea was to give frustrated local campaigners some access to the general mass media to advertise their meetings. Regularly, the Liberal Party called to give us their list. 3. Over a 7-week period, each side was given no more than 6 hours and 20 minutes. On the final count, the ALP had 7 minutes more than Liberal NCP, only one more per week." Now, this letter lets us know that Double J was active in trying to engage a wide variety of political voices in a discussion for young people to hear. There may well be other interviews like the Whitlam one I'm talking about today, sitting in archives, in garages, in attics somewhere. There's much more unearthing to be done. However, keeping focus on this interview at the moment, if nothing else, because that's all time is allowed so far, up until now, details of the participating Double J interviewers have been actually lost as well. In fact, the original text doesn't identify anyone from Double J at all. Each inquiry is merely labelled question. There were tiny traces in the body of the text, brief mentions of the first names Marius, Nick, Dennis and Tina, but confirming who those people were has proven quite the task. I've been in touch with some former Double J staff and think we've started to make some positive identifications. The first, Marius Webb, was the station's founding coordinator. He worked tirelessly to help build the station and ABC Radio for decades on, and he remains an invaluable source for helping trace back the station's early days. Marius was one of the participants in the interview and recalled that it was likely to have been included in the Sunday night program hosted by Tina Jorgensen, a former folk singer who sung under the name Tina Date. She hosted a weekly program on Double J during its early days. She would do this for a few months before disappearing overseas to eventually work in the US, particularly for the UN, advocating for the position of women, among other things. Marius also speculated that the other participants were likely Dennis Altman, a regular contributor to the show as a specialist political commentator, and journalist Nick Franklin from the news department. Looking back at the newspaper listings for radio at the time, this looked likely, although put some doubt over whether the interview actually took place, where the interview actually took place. So the archives say December 8, a Monday. At Tina's show would have been December 7, a Sunday. A little hole there. Following this lead, I was able to find Nick, now retired after many years of service as an award-winning radio journalist. He generously gave his time to help me dust off some of this little gem. He helped with several other leads, however had to admit, and these are his words, "It's a long time ago, but I do remember interviewing Gough. We were in a studio in Sydney and Gough was in a studio in Canberra. However, I'm afraid I recall very little of the interview itself, other than, rather nervously, asking Gough what he thought his biggest mistake was. Kerr, of course." Slowly creeping a little bit closer here, I tried to track down another of the voices. While I've not been able to track Tina down, she did tell ABC Radio Canberra in 2012 that she remembered interviewing Whitlam around the time of the dismissal and election gap. She didn't name Double J and the others in the recording, but she notes that at the time she enjoyed the interview and would have liked to get him on air again, this time with her friend Jermaine. Now, what an event that would have been, assuming it's the Jermaine we're thinking of. The final piece of the puzzle was Dennis Altman, now an emeritus professor in human sciences at La Trobe University in Melbourne. He also generously lent some time, and although he didn't recall much of the interview at all, his contemporary perspective on this lost piece was really useful. What I mean is, this is a person now looking back at this piece of radio history. Now, Dennis asked simply, politely, but matter-of-factly, why would you want to know who these people were? Why would you want to go back? What does this all matter? Dennis's question is really important because it reminded me, and hopefully you listening, to look back on this piece of radio with more than just a base level curiosity. Yes, there is lots of interesting trivia just for trivia's sake. For example, the song that was played just after the interview concluded was Instant Karma by John Lennon. Subtle editorial statement, maybe just a happy accident, just nice trivia, all of that is very true. But Dennis's question, why does it matter, helps us 40 years on to consider the legacy that then Double and now Triple J established. It reminds us to look at this in terms of what the station has gone on to provide, rather than just keep this as a museum piece to be admired. What I found so interesting upon the first listen to this interview was that these voices sounded, well, not typical of radio. The interviewers were not sleek and deep and hyper-masculine like commercial stations of the time, or indeed still now. Instead, they were higher in pitch, formal but still relaxed in style, and shockingly, they sounded really obviously young. There was a twang in the accent, kind of Australian, but kind of BBC, kind of unsure still, but still a bold tone. Towards the end in particular, the interviewers actively remind Mr. Whitlam that they, and by extension their listeners, are very different to the people currently making decisions on their behalf. While I obviously can't play you all of the interview, let me play you just that little part.
Mr. Whitlam, could I tempt you back for a moment? You mentioned schools and so on, and again our audience is often largely a very young one. And how realistically wealthy graziers and prime ministers, they're minority sort of groups really.
That's right.
Most people don't have those sort of jobs. And how realistically...
Oh, well, the appointed ones both.
Excuse me for him.
Can a generation that politicians and parliamentarians are honestly represent with some sort of understanding and compassion a generation who would quite often lately probably think that laws are being made just purely and simply against their existence and sort of lifestyle, which is obviously very different to that of the lifestyle of the generation who's the ruling power?
Well, I suppose you're asking me these things, expect me to be a bit subjective. I've been saved to a certain extent by having children in their teens or their 20s during this period. And so I do at least have that contact with the age groups to which you mentioned. I do believe that the public is alert to the difference between the parties. We have spent a very great deal of money on new programs, education, health, welfare and urban programs. Now, this costs money, it takes taxpayers' money, but at least these programs are for the benefit of everybody.
Not to mention 2JJ.
Not exactly. Although 2JJ actually is a very economic investment. It's run on a shoestring.
Nothing changes. I love this question because it does make me wonder what would have happened without Double J. Who and where else would young people have had the opportunity to directly ask someone in power to imagine himself as a young person of the time? It is significant that there should be a young female voice asking this question. Tina was one of an early group who would go on to slowly build women in the media, slowly, but still important. Whitlam's acknowledgement that his knowledge of a young person's experience is present but still somewhat removed is also an important distinction that really gives the listener a powerful position. In having Whitlam state his context for decision making, I have some contact with that age group. young people are able to make an informed decision about whether they think that context and that contact is enough. In short, is being a parent of a young person enough contact in order to make policy? Maybe it is, or not. But you let the listener decide by giving them that detail. While, as I say earlier, I regret that there's no time to go back and try and unearth more interviews with other political leaders from around this time for today. This question and response does, I think, move towards showing the development of a particular way of addressing young people in the media more broadly. Certainly not a dictation of what you should do, but a presentation of context that invites them to draw their own conclusions. This line of inquiry directly turns the conversation to the purpose and possible future of Double J itself. The exchange includes a clear question that is asked and answered, with a type of directness that we don't really see from political journalism these days. I want to play you that too, again so that the content and context of the exchange hits you, the nuance that the voices give us, the high and low sounds, the relative energy levels or lack thereof that comes from one side and is returned from the other.
Do you have any idea, as it's of particular interest to us and our listeners, what might happen to us if your government isn't re-elected?
All I can say is that Senator Greenwood, who is ideologically very close to Mr. Fraser, has questioned the propriety of all these new radio stations. And of course 2JJ and 3ZZ could be closed just by taking their transmitters from them and making them standby transmitters once again. It's not generally realised that these two stations rely on transmitters which have always been there but which were just idle. They were just standby transmitters for 2BL and 2FC in your case. And admittedly, if anything happened to the 2FC or 2BL transmitters, I suppose you'd be off the air immediately. But nothing ever has happened to their transmitters. So you could be closed down at the whim of an executive. The Parliament wouldn't have any say in it at all.
Now, this comment reminds us that the fate of Double J and Triple J was not certain, and its development and continuation was initially perhaps just a happy accident. Nobody noticed, nobody minded, keep going. Following this comment, Whitlam continued here to delve into the different types of legal arguments that an incoming Fraser government might make in order to decide the fate of the station. Arguments over the Federal Wireless and Broadcasting Acts, which are interesting, but perhaps a bit too detailed for us here on a Monday morning, some 40 years later. So instead, I want to play you the very end of the interview, the type of thing that these days would be re-edited as a lead soundbite for a story.
Mr. Whitlam, I'm awfully glad that you've been able to join us before we possibly put off the air. We have half a minute left of time.
Well, as far as we're concerned, your guaranteed existence is sure.
Well, that's absolutely wonderful. I'd like to thank you very much for joining us on the program, and Marius and Dennis and Nick, and hopefully you'll join us again in the future as Prime Minister.
Thank you, Tina. I look forward to it.
That was a little bit naughty, that last bit, wasn't it? Yeah. What I love about this exchange is how Tina is almost a bit rattled. Did she just get an election promise scoop as part of her closing remark? Was she a bit shocked that Whitlam would go into such detail about the broadcasting policy? Was she just a bit distracted, getting ready to play the next record as the producer wound her up for time? Instant karma, remember? We now know, listening in 2015, what happened next. Double J did indeed survive and thrive, even though Whitlam was not to come back as Prime Minister on air again. While Whitlam was not returned to power, his impact and legacy would be far from forgotten, confirmed in many ways over the years, and last but least of all, with the outpourings of respect from all sides of politics that sent him off when he passed late last year. To return to Dennis's line of questioning, why does it matter? What are we looking for when we go back to these young people conducting this interview with a lost leader from 40 years ago? Why are we looking back at Double J's beginnings with such focus? To answer this, I want to play you just one more clip from the interview, this time as part of the introductory question which I think is Marius.
Mr. Whitlam, can I ask you a question first? The situation, obviously, the past is going to affect the future, and the question that immediately comes to my mind, and I think perhaps anyone who thinks about the structure of our governmental system, is where do we go from here?
So this comment and this piece of Double J history matters because it reminds us that media history, like all history, can have a real effect on what those in the present day consider to be possible, where we all go from here. I think it matters because it is also an example of young Australians learning to find a place in the media, taking and developing opportunities for themselves and building foundations that others could also build more on. We know that the provision of a breakthrough opportunity is something that Double and Triple J has gone on and done for many young Australian broadcasters, commentators, musicians and other artists over the last 4 decades. These 4 interviewers in 1975, Marius Webb, Tina Jorgensen, Nick Franklin and Dennis Altman, were just some of the first in a long line that has benefited and continues to benefit from this. For the audiences listening at home and since, the platform developed during this time has also been inspirational, asking them to continue to listen, participate, be educated, informed and entertained. So where do we go from here? While Marius, Nick, Tina and Dennis may be remembered or perhaps misplaced by some, their sound makes it possible for us to have a media for young people that is now just that. It really does include young people and a variety of those. It is now not unusual for young and diverse voices to be part of the national conversation. Commentators on Triple J and commercial outlets with a variety of race, gender, religious and political perspectives. The original brief to develop Double J, the ABC's quest for creative programming, has never been easier in terms of the means of production and dissemination. The difference between the experiences of these media professionals in their 30s and in the 1970s, and say me, something of a media professional in her 30s in 2015, is that these days it doesn't occur to me that I wouldn't be able to find a place. The success of Double J and its offshoots has opened up and pushed the commercial market to young people in broader terms. Fewer older guardians and gender cliches as audiences mobilise and prove that they want something different, something creative, something energetic. And if they haven't been able to find what they want already, increasingly young people have been given the confidence to go out and create those outlets themselves. So, like that daughter at Mum and Dad's 40th, the perspective I can give you on Double J's beginnings is necessarily removed. My first-hand experience is not of Double J in 1975, but what it would become. The now national youth network that is Triple J, on air and online, a place that has Hottest 100s, unearthed competitions, J-Files, as well as a digital-only station named in its parents' honour. That's right, Double J is, of course, now an on-air digital station. But in looking back at the history of what began 40 years today, I hope I can, from my perspective, show you what mattered about it. A period that would give me and us the young people's media outlet we know today. It also makes me wonder what might not have been if 2JJ had not kicked off and kicked on. Perhaps the biggest change is that now there are so many voices that it has become hard to focus over the noise sometimes. New media outlets are emerging and different ways of doing things are being developed at a rapid pace. But that's a new problem and one for today's young people in the media to navigate for the future, with any luck doing so with the same goodwill and good humour of their Double J ancestors. So happy birthday Double and then Triple J, and a huge congratulations to all those who went there and went on boldly, surveyed the land and tried to speak for and beyond the media they knew at the time. Long may you be on air, beating your drum. Thank you.
There's an opportunity for some questions and probing, I guess, of Liz, and I think we might even be able to do a couple of comments on such a special day. So, as a courtesy, if you feel comfortable doing so, could you just introduce yourself before you ask Liz your question? Liz, what else?
That was a wonderful lecture, Liz. Really terrific. I'll talk more about it later. But there are two questions. One is I'm re-appalled, if such a word exists, at how difficult it is to lay your hands on important archival tapes from the ABC, because I've tried that for the 60s and so on. My first question is, as far as you know, is there no formal archival process for this kind of thing? That's the first question. Second question is, I'm thinking back to Radio Caroline now in the UK. You spelled out very clearly, I think, the importance of Double J and Triple J. Can you talk, I know you've done a lot of work with the BBC, can you talk about any kind of equivalent process there? They are my two questions.
Okay, the first one, yes, there is an archive at the ABC, and to be fair, yes, they are doing their very best. I guess archives, though, is one of those things that gets cut when the axe comes. And to be fair as well, I guess when you're sitting in 1975 on a shoestring, as Mr. Whitlam said, who thinks to spend money on tape recorders? To record it and then to label it and maintain it. One of the original Double Jers who I spoke to, Ros Chaney, who was a secretary for Marius Webb at the time, has very generously been in touch with me and did tell me about her process of holding on to things. And the problem has been, my understanding is that with subsequent moves, things have been lost. So I did speak to the ABC, who initially said, look, with radio, you're going to have a hard time finding stuff. And it's television's the same thing. If it exists, it might not have been archived. If it's been archived, we're not sure what format sometimes. So it's not necessarily, or I wouldn't say at all, a case that the organisation doesn't have a process. It's just that there's so much content going through it. Pardon? Oh, I understand that. Yeah, I understand that. Yeah. So, but it was interesting because in finding this, and as I say, my colleague Janine said, oh, the National Archives, just give them a crack. And then in finding that and then having a dance between the two organisations was interesting too, to say, well, who now owns copyright of this? So this recording was actually made by Whitlam's staffers. So, and you probably can't tell from those clips, but I think what happened was he had a cassette player set up on his desk in Canberra while then listening to down the line the Double J's in Sydney, to the point where at times the phone rings and people get their keys out and all that kind of fabulous stuff. And that's how I also found out that Instant Karma was played afterwards, because somebody forgot the tape was running. So it's thank you, Mr. Whitlam, and then you hear the opening chords of John Lennon, and then there's a bit of to and fro and backwards and forwards. So I was very disappointed that there wasn't also a sneaky, gee, wasn't that fabulous? Or, oh, wasn't that terrible, those long-haired buffoons? So there was none of that kind of context there. As for the BBC, I have to admit that radio is something that, again, is so huge with them. So my work with them was on television. So I can't answer that with the authority that I'd like to be able to. I hope you don't mind.
We might take the middle first, Amy, and then down the back.
Thanks, Liz. It's a great reminder of this station, and my first work experience as a 16-year-old was in the Double J in 82, actually. So I remember, the quite crazy and, makeshift offices of Double J at that time. Of course, there are links sustained throughout with some of the practitioners, such as Tony Barrell, who sadly passed away a few years ago, who was perhaps one of the most prominent documentary radio producers, who often did co-productions between ABC and BBC for much of his documentary work, especially in Asia and Japan and so forth. And I know that his partner is celebrating with a lot of the other producers today. So yes. It is something that reminds us that there are many people such as Ros, their contemporaries who are alive, and it's a reminder to record and as much of their recollections as possible, and that there are actually many people who are still, alive and kicking and with really vivid memories of those days. But it also was reflective of the surf culture, and of course for years Double J used to just have surf reports and so forth. So there was an internal battle between the sort of the wax heads and when new music came and punk. So that's another sort of internal history with the coming of new wave and everything that happened internally. So thanks for your presentation, and there's a lot more to be done about the station. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi Liz, it's Judy Holman from UWS Careers.
Hi, Judy.
I'm just wondering,
Sorry, I can't hear you very well.
I'm just wondering if any stats are available on how many listeners from those early days are still listening, like myself, or if the demographic leaves when they reach a certain age to the ABC, or...
Wow. It's interesting because the thing with Double J again is that in theory it was just a tiny little transmitter that was coming out of Sydney that should have just been for Sydney. But it's one of those things that is certainly, it has grown, the legacy has grown. And in looking back now, as I say, when I first started listening to Triple J, I just couldn't believe that you wouldn't be able to hear it all over Australia in any format you wanted. And, you know, back in those stories where AM, I mean, you know, depending on where the hills were, you could and if the wind was blowing in the right direction, you could get quite good coverage in Tassie, but you couldn't get coverage in Sydney's eastern suburbs, you know, so it'd be really hard to work that out definitively. I suspect that over at Ultimo at the moment, all of those stats are being done and lots of people are claiming to have been there at the time. But the thing that I love, and I think it's an energy that should never be stopped, is that anything to do with popular music and popular culture like that, lots of people will claim to have been there. I mean, there can't have been that many people that saw Nirvana at the big day out or all of that either, you know? But so the answer to the question is I don't know, although I'm hoping that with each successive celebration more and more are getting on board. And I can say, for example, I went to Triple J's 40th concert on Friday in the Domain, and I was really, really struck by the diversity of the audiences there. There were several generations of people sitting on the grass, lining up for beer for an hour and a half, you know, but also then enjoying the different songs that were coming out, you know, so everything from Australian Crawl to the Divinyls to brand new Hilltop Hood stuff was all being played all at once. So I certainly think that there is room for new and old listeners still.
Thank you. Justine Lloyd from Macquarie University. So I was just picking up on that point. There was a tension, a really interesting tension, which came out in the interview when Tina, I think it was, asked the question about minority interests and about the, you know, our Prime Ministers and grazing minority, which is such a great question. But the way that Whitlam answered it, I thought raised a question about, was Triple J for everybody, and was this sort of progressive vision of Australia that he was trying to kind of recuperate within, you know, the dismissal and so on, was that actually a much wider and bigger program? And Triple J seemed to me to be breaking ground, not just for young people, but for all sorts of differences. And I just wonder how you could sort of answer that within the research that you've done, and perhaps even the interview bits that we didn't hear, how that came out.
Yeah, definitely. Well, a lot of those people that went on have gone on to be really important commentators for relative minorities. Someone like Tina, as I say, was an advocate for women. Someone like Dennis has written some amazing academic work on, say, queer identities and that type of stuff. So certainly those people would go on. And Nick Franklin, again, has covered the news from a lot of different perspectives. What's interesting, I guess, about that is that Double J had the problem then that Triple J still has now, and the ABC does generally, insofar as how do you represent as many Australians as possible, but also somehow fill the gap that is left by the commercials. So at the moment, Triple J is having the argument over their Hottest 100 annual countdown, which is meant to be the most popular music that happens, you know, for the year. There's been a big uproar by mainstream Taylor Swift fans that, you know, Shake It Off wasn't included in their countdown, you know, drop-down list, because why would that commercial crap be included on our Triple J? Now, in one way you can say, okay, well that commercial stuff has its place on commercial radio, leave it there and give the limited space of Triple J to bands that don't have a space anywhere else. But on the other side, you can say, well, the people that like Taylor Swift also spend their taxpayers, they are taxpayers as well. They should also have their place there. So it's that really interesting tension, I think. I think certainly Double J and Triple J and the ABC generally are asked more often than the commercials, and are expected more often to speak for themselves. So that piece that Lee wrote, that letter to the editor, where he had to defend the coverage, I think was really interesting, because I can't imagine a commercial ever doing the maths, let alone then publishing it like that. And it was a little bit naughty in Tina's, you know, response, where she says, "I hope you come back as Prime Minister." He did have to acknowledge that perhaps sometimes the announcers did slip a little bit, but you know, they all understood that they did have a job to try and represent as many people as possible, particularly those who they felt didn't have a place. And it's certainly something in those, as you say, places to still be unearthed. There was a huge amount that was done for women, representing women as well. I know Gail Austin's been very active in talking about her involvement, but there are many, many other women who haven't been spoken about on air and behind the scenes. Ros had an amazing archive of stuff, that again, in looking at one, I think we forget to keep on looking at everybody else. So there was International Women's Day where the station was taken over in that first year in 1975 that we don't read about that much, even though it happened. And maybe it's, the classic case of women need to write women's history. So here we are.
This might be heresy at the Whitlam Institute. Have you come across any evidence of Malcolm Fraser actually being interviewed on Double J? Because, obviously we owe a huge debt to the Whitlam government for liberating the Australian airways, but the Fraser government continued to do that, most notably with the rise of, or enabling the development of the ethnic radio sector. So I'm just wondering, have you come across any coalition presence?
Yeah, I have been looking. So I contacted the Fraser Institute, I guess kind of, can I say the sister institute to this, in the University of Melbourne, who are, yes, that's right, who aren't as well staffed at the moment, let's put it that way. So I did put in a request to them with exactly that question, saying, look, I would love to know if Mr. Fraser participated. I'd love to be able to include some of it. I'd love to, have access to those materials. And there's a huge archive there, but it hasn't been forthcoming just yet. It was interesting in some of the correspondences with some of the other, with some of those old Double Jers. They certainly recalled public rallies and things that were broadcast that, people talked about that, so I'm hoping, again, as I say, someone in a garage somewhere might have a tape, and it might be, with a bit of luck, we can provoke you to come out of the woodwork. So, yeah, but as of yet, no, I haven't.
Just in your opinion, what do you think lies ahead for Triple J?
That's a very good question.
How long do you think they'll be in the radio for?
Yeah, well, Triple J and Double J, because I hope Double J stays on digital as well. And today, Double J, as we speak, are rebroadcasting their first hour, apparently. I don't know where they found it, but they keep on finding things. So actually, I should answer to that too. This morning, they said they just found an old Midnight Oil concert that they thought was lost. So people, this is the value of cleaning up. Open a box and you'll find things, apparently. Which is great. And so I hope that both will continue really strongly. So something like Double J, as it exists only on digital now, is really interesting because if you listen to it like I do in my office on a computer while I'm doing other things, it gives you access to things in a way that I hadn't considered before. So I can say, oh, what's the name of that? Who was that? I can Google that while I'm there. It gives me a different way of experiencing radio and re-experiencing things. There's also, of course, podcasting now. So the idea that radio, blink and you miss it, is not the case anymore at all. Not only can I take it with me anywhere I want to go, I can also take it when I want to take it, which I think is really important. The thing too of the way Triple J is now, which is, radio is really multimedia now, and I think that energy and that want to continue to chase the audience wherever they want to be is something that will be the future and something that they really actively continue to pursue. So I have to admit, looking at them and talking to them, there's been a couple of people at Triple J who've been very, very generous with their time, although heaven knows where they find their time. It's going to be a real struggle in some ways because, you've got people who are young and eager but also only have 24 hours in the day. So, it's going to be interesting to see how they maintain, their position if their resources continue to be, shall I say, stretched. However, at the moment, it looks like they're taking it just in their stride and as a challenge. If you can manage in a makeshift studio in King's Cross somewhere in 1975 and still get it done, we'll be right now. We've got Google, we'll be okay. So hopefully we're having a conversation or listening in 40 years' time. That's what I'd like. Really like that.
What a perfect note to finish. Again, if we just thank Liz. And Liz's address will be preserved for posterity and available on demand very soon. Could I ask Professor Bridget Griffin-Foley, who is the Director of the Centre for Media History, to say a few words of thanks.
Thank you so much, Eric. As Eric noted, I'm from the Centre for Media History at Macquarie. Since our formation in 2007, we have joined forces with a range of organisations, from cultural institutions through to corporate bodies, to host events exploring the history of the Australian media in particular. When I joined Liz's department 2 years ago, one of the first things she said to me was, you know that Triple J's 40th anniversary is coming up. So she's been an absolute enthusiast for and an advocate for really exploring the vital and dynamic role of Double J and Triple J in the Australian media landscape. And we started talking to the Whitlam Institute, I think, in the middle of last year. Liz and I were very excited to sit in Goff's chair. And it's been an absolutely, hectic time for the Whitlam Institute in recent months, but they've been an absolute delight to work with. Of all of the organisations we've dealt with, so professional, so collegial, so engaged. So thank you very much for that. And we hope this might be the beginning of a deeper relationship with Macquarie. I think Murray Goot and I might try to get some of our colleagues in history and politics to bring some of their students out here, because the resources are absolutely wonderful for research and for education. So in addition to Eric himself, the director, I'd like to thank Amy Sandbrook. She was working right up almost until Christmas Eve working on this, and Sandra Stevenson and Lorraine West, who holds the vital position of archivist. So thank you all for your efforts. At the ABC, we should acknowledge Chris Scadden, the manager of Triple J, for engaging with us through last year on what we might do. Virginia McKinnon for assisting Liz with research, and to Dr. Jane Connors, an ABC executive who sits on the Centre's board. And Jane has kindly arranged for the recording by Big Ideas. There has been, I think, a bit of a question or an interest today in the issue of archives, so I am going to give the Centre's Media Archives project a plug. There's some information on that on the table in the refreshment area. So if any of you have material about Triple J that is literally under a bed or in a garage, we'd be very interested in knowing about it and having a summary of it entered into our database. If you or friends or colleagues don't know what to do with this material, please feel free to come and talk to us, and we can help advise on where might be an appropriate place for that material to go. Finally, huge thanks to Dr. Liz Giuffre, the most wonderful colleague, and she was telling me for over a year that there's been a reasonable amount of research done on Triple J, but I think what she did today was really advance that scholarship quite considerably, to not just focusing on the role in music, but its role in Australian youth culture. And there are so many questions I want to ask about International Women's Year, for instance, the Women in Politics Conference. There's just so many leads I think that we can pursue. So we look forward to the Whitlam paper that will come after this. Finally, please join us for a light lunch, and Eric would like to invite you to stay to view the exhibition A Changing Australia, The Time of Gough Whitlam. Thanks very much for coming.
Needless to say, we love collaboration at the Whitlam Institute, and we would welcome the opportunities to explore deeper and further, and not simply in the history of Double J, but of course within our remit is not simply the Prime Ministerial Library, but a very active public policy institute. So there's lots of a future to talk about. For the moment though, thank you all very, very much. It's been wonderful to have you here at our little place. Thank you once again.